Welcome, everyone, and thanks for joining us today for our webinar on accelerating AI in healthcare with data-centric AI. I'm John Marini, Director of Growth here at Snorkel AI, and I'll be your host for today's event. And now I'd like to take a moment to introduce our presenters, Arti Bagul and Arjun Prakash. Arti is a machine learning engineer here at Snorkel AI, where she enables organizations across banking, healthcare, and government to solve complex ML problems using Snorkel Flow. Before Snorkel AI, she worked closely with Andrew Ng in various capacities at AI Fund, helping to build and invest in ML companies. Arthea was also a machine learning engineer at Andrew's startup Landing AI. She graduated with a master's in computer science from Stanford and with a bachelor's in computer science and engineering from NYU with highest honors. We are also fortunate to be joined today by Arjun Prakash. Arjun heads Snorkel AI's product and go-to-market investments for use cases and solutions across industries, including healthcare. Before Snorkel AI, Arjun worked at Palantir, where he was an early employee of the commercial business and spent 8 years building and leading various teams focused on healthcare, financial services, and commercial strategy. Arjun has a degree in computer and electrical, a degree in electrical and computer engineering from Cornell University. And now it's my pleasure to hand the presentation over to Arjun and Arti.
Thanks so much, John. It's honestly a privilege to be able to share our work with you all and also learn from everyone how we can continue to add value to healthcare organizations. I want to just take a moment to just talk about what you'll see during the course of this webinar. I'm going to kick it off in just like 10 minutes about the opportunities and challenges that we're seeing in healthcare, and also share with you Snorkel's approach to ameliorating some of those challenges through a data-centric approach to AI development. And then I'm incredibly excited to have Arti share with you some extremely real-world outcomes that we have enabled with our platform at our partners across multiple different verticals, payers, providers, and pharma, and also a case study on a double click into one of those. Awesome. So I want to just start by spending a minute really talking about why I personally am so excited about the role of AI in healthcare. And I want to just clear up that this is not meant to be exhaustive or prescriptive, but it's rather based on our experience working directly with pharma, payers, and providers. But as the experts in the field, we're really looking to learn from everybody attending this call on how we can continue to add value and make healthcare fundamentally more value additive to people's lives. So I want to talk about two levels at which I think AI has a role to play. The first really is cost and efficiency. And I think this really is because the US healthcare system is incredibly complex. There are multiple different parties involved in the system, and it's also very mature. It's built on generations of processes that have led us to where we are today. And while this has produced unprecedented advances in safety, it has also created a lot of process and overhead. And there are many ways in which this manifests itself, but to just give you some statistics that I'm sure people are already familiar with, the average cost of bringing a new drug into the market is about $2.6 billion. The US healthcare system absorbs almost 20% of US GDP. And misdiagnosis is the fourth leading cause of death amongst providers. And that's not because we actually have some of the best providers in the world. It's just because they're so overworked now more than ever. And add to that the overhead of administrative tasks, and people are just extremely inundated. Once we look past cost and efficiency, I also think AI has a role to play in it. And that's because as we accumulate more and more data about how the body works, AI really can help use that data in a really first-class way to unlock new advances in medicine. And these include things like personalized medicine, rare disease treatments, things that fundamentally are pushing the frontier of science and improving quality of care. But then this begs the question, if we all agree that AI has a role to play in healthcare, why is it so hard? And based on our experience having worked with our part, we've seen a few causative factors. First is the nature of the data itself. So the data is semi-structured and unstructured. So take, for example, doctor notes, clinical trials data, EHR records. These need to be processed to create structure when the model can use them effectively. There's also a data harmonization problem. So the healthcare system is definitely fragmented, and that creates a bunch of process overhead. But what that also practically creates is a diversity of collection methods, equipment, units, etc., And so this data needs to be harmonized and made consistent so you can run a model across the entirety of the data. We also see that it is extremely expensive to label data and create a training set to build a model on top of. And what this practically ends up manifesting in is people work with incomplete or unrepresentative developmental data, and that affects the quality of the application that people are looking to bring into production. And while in the case of a social media company or some software companies, it might be okay to get a not perfect model out and then move fast and break things. In the cost of healthcare, that is it is incredibly, it costs a lot to be able to bring something inefficient out because it's people's lives at stake. And so the bar is much higher for quality to get something up. I also want to talk about the sensitivity of the data, right? So this is patient data, or the patients have placed incredible trust in the healthcare system to protect their data. And what that practically means is the data needs to be treated as such. And it doesn't necessarily lend itself to offshoring, et cetera, which are some of the ways in which data gets labeled in some other industries. And lastly, and I would say personally, most importantly, the SME expertise is really at a premium in the healthcare industry. And that's because biomedical data is extremely nuanced, requires expertise. And we already talked about how practitioners, people on the front lines, and SMEs are extremely overworked. And add to that an additional burden of labeling data, and it's just not tenable. And so these are some of the challenges that we're seeing today that are really introducing inertia into developing good, high-quality AI applications. The thing that all of these have in common that we're observing is that they all have to do with data. And so data is the common bottleneck. We see a lot of people talking about the models, how to monitor the models, and the analysis of the models, but not enough people are talking about the data itself, the quality of the data, and the labels of the data. And so I really want to spend a few minutes just talking about some of the capabilities of the Snorkel platform and our philosophy of how we think about to motivate what solutions to this problem could look like. So the first capability I want to talk about on the Snorkel platform is programmatic labeling. Snorkel allows you to define heuristics or labeling functions that allow you to intelligently capture the intuition of a subject matter expert or an SME, and then scale it across large quantities of data and let the computer do that. So you use the human for what the human is really good at, and you use the computer for what the computer is really good at. The second capability I want to talk about is iterative model development. Not just in healthcare, but in AI application development at large, we see that problem formulation requires multiple passes. And also the data requires multiple iterations to get it to be ready. And so practically what that manifests in is the need for multiple iterations of the data labeling and of the model training to actually be able to come up with an application that solves a problem. And so this iterative loop is extremely important to us, and we try to empower practitioners on the platform to do this in a first-class way. I want to talk about keeping models relevant over time. And that's the third bullet, monitoring and adaptability. Once you create a model or an application and move it into production, you need to be able to adapt it to changing data and changing objectives. In healthcare, more so than in many other fields, we're learning more about the body and about how drugs and molecules interact with the body on almost a weekly basis. And this fundamentally requires us to relabel the data, update label schemas, and retrain models on a regular basis to capture the best understanding we have so the AI applications are useful. And lastly, all of this needs to be done within a platform that's enterprise ready. Because A, it needs to work with your existing investments, both data and in business applications, and B, be secure so that patient data is not compromised. And when we take this platform and this approach and apply it to healthcare, we notice a few things. Number one, the application templates in the platform for information extraction and harmonization allow you to deal with semi-structured and unstructured data to extract the most relevant data and make it AI ready so you can run models on them. It also allows you to harmonize the data in a first-class way so the data becomes AI ready. Programmatic labeling, which we talked about, allows you to capture an SME's intuition and scale it rapidly across the entirety of your data. So you're not working with cuts of the data, and instead are able to work with high-quality labeled data on all of what you have. And because you're able to do it in a very scalable and efficient way, you can do it in-house. And you don't have to deal with offshoring it, given that the data is so sensitive. And the labeling functions that make programmatic labeling possible, those heuristics, what they practically mean is that your SME engages with you in providing their intuitions and their understandings, not in actually manually labeling every data point, which is time consuming and maybe not the best use of their time. And so you use the SME's time for what is most effective and productive, and use the computer to then automate the scaling out process. The result of this is a very iterative loop that allows you to create AI applications with the best available data in a fast, responsive, and scalable way. So you can get applications into production and keep them relevant over time. But I now want to make this real for you, because this is a lot of high-level conversation. And so what I'm actually very excited about is now to pass it over to Aarti to talk about some very real-world examples of problems that we have solved with our partners.
Amazing. Thank you, Arjun. So for the second part of this webinar, I'm going to walk you through some representative use cases that you might be seeing and how Snorkel Flow can help you solve those use cases and get some business value. I'm going to walk through use cases in all three of the major entities that we have in healthcare. So in pharma, in payers, as well as providers. I'll start off with a broad variety of use cases that you may see and be wanting to tackle, give one specific example from each of the three entities, and then just due to time constraints, dive deeper into just one of them. So if you are somebody who is working at a provider or a payer, the two types of use cases that you might be interested in are around claims processing or tools for doctor. Around claims processing, you probably have a large number of unstructured data around the insurance claims for medical coding, the documents that are required for prior authorization, as well as just other scanned documents related to insurance claims. And as Arjun had mentioned, some of the challenges around this data is that, again, you have a large number of just private data, so you can't send it out for labeling. You have to do it internally. And you need specialized subject matter experts, or SMEs, which is a term we used previously in the webinar. So you have expensive subject matter experts, which are nurses, physicians, or clinicians who have to sit there labeling data, which is just infeasible a lot of times, just because doctor's time or physician time is quite valuable. But using Snorkel Flow and our programmatic labeling paradigm, which lets you bring in subject matter experts in a more efficient way through this notion of programmatic labeling, you can speed up the manual coding that's either done by low-skill labor forces and just automate that, or also just save SME time or doctor time in this case for more complex use cases such as prior authorization. Similarly, for the use cases around tools for doctors, some of the data sources that you may have lying around are unstructured data around population health information, or just device outputs from, let's say, medical devices or lab results. So just a large amount of data lying around. And using Snorkel Flow, what you can do is save nurse and patient time around patient population insights, as well as just aiding doctor productivity around diagnosing and triaging patients. So this is just to paint a picture of some of the use cases that you might want to tackle with Snorkel Flow around payers and providers. This is not meant to be an exhaustive list, but just as you're thinking through your own AI journey, just to give you some amount of inspiration also in terms of use cases we generally see and the outcomes that you're able to achieve. And to make this a little more concrete, one example that we've seen from a provider is extracting insights from historical doctor notes and pathology reports. So for research use cases, this provider was looking to take the large amount of historical data that they have, which is, again, unstructured doctor notes, pathology reports, and do analysis across all these reports to find trends and correlations. So let's say for a particular type of disease, we want to see, can we find trends and correlations such that we'd be able to predict this disease before it happens in a patient, or just generally have more informative research to progress our information and our knowledge about that disease category. So let's say, again, using current techniques, if you had to do this, you would have to sit there, and have a doctor manually label and look at each doctor note and pathology report, and then categorize that and turn that into structured information. Again, extremely infeasible to take physician time away to label tens of thousands of documents all at once. So with programmatic labeling, you're able to specify rules or heuristics to label large amounts of data all at once in-house, and take this iterative approach as well through our platform to develop machine learning applications to do this more efficiently. An example from a payer that we've seen is determining patient eligibility for medical assistance. Here, let's say you have a claim coming in from a patient, and currently nurses are sitting there looking at the claim that comes in, as well as the large amount of patient records that you have or healthcare records for the patient, and then saying, do I think this claim is supported or refuted based on the patient records that I have at hand? So the current process, again, takes up a large amount of nurse time. It leads to a very fragmented process, and also is not an ideal experience for the patient either, because to get the insurance to cover that, they have to deal with the delays as well as deal with this whole fragmented process that this goes through. And you can solve this using machine learning, and they wanted to, but again, same issue as before, where if you had to label this clinical data or patient records by hand, you'd have to have a nurse sit there and label each data point by hand. And in this case, they estimated that, or actually they tried this out internally using hand labeling, and it took 12 nurses a month to do this for just one type of claim, let's say. So to expand this to a set of procedures, they estimated that it would take a year to develop this application. And of course, again, it's private data, so you can't send it out for labeling. So again, manual approach doesn't really work here. And so Snorkel's programmatic approach, as I mentioned again, lets you specify rationales as to why you would want, as to how you would label this data. So to give you an example, one of the rules that you might write is extract all the medical entities from the claim, either using a machine learning model or some existing ontology, see if that is matched in the patient record or is mentioned in the patient record in a similar way. So those types of rules that you can write with Snorkel Flow, which are noisy rules, lets you label a large amount of data all at once, and then we can denoise it for you and label a large amount of data very effectively. So again, a great example of where Snorkel Flow is able to make this process just feasible in a very reasonable amount of time. If you're somebody who works at a pharma company, the types of use cases that you might be interested in are largely around clinical trial analytics or real world evidence. So for clinical trial analytics, you have a large amount of clinical trial data, really large documents come in a wide variety of format. Again, if you have to have somebody, a clinical scientist, sit there and label data, it just takes a large amount of time. But you may be able to use all these data sources using Snorkel Flow and achieve the outcomes of being able to design better clinical trials. You may be able to identify patients who satisfy some inclusion-exclusion criteria or pull out that information from the record. You can speed up adverse event reporting to regulators. Any data that comes in, you have to screen for adverse events, and currently it's done super manually, but you could automate that using this programmatically through Snorkel Flow, as well as just being able to structure this large amount of historical data that you have such that you're then able to search through relevant trials, experiments, and published research. The second major category, real world evidence. Again, you may have a large amount of data lying around that's patient healthcare data, either from claims or EHR data, and you may have some unstructured columns there too, which is, again, doctor's notes. You may also have patient data from various sources, and the outcomes that you could achieve through Snorkel Flow and using machine learning to automate parts of this is figuring out, let's say, drug safety, treatment efficacy, as well as just developing an advanced disease understanding by using this data and actually making it actionable and valuable. So again, just to paint a picture of some of the use cases that you might be interested in and that we would be able to help you with using Snorkel Flow. And again, to make it more concrete with a singular use case, we worked with Genentech around clinical trial analytics. The use case I briefly mentioned, which is given a clinical trial document, which again is a really large document, comes in a wide variety of formats, they wanted to extract what are the inclusion and exclusion criteria for a clinical trial. So there's usually a section in this clinical trial protocol document that specifies a patient could have this condition, but not this, and that would indicate that they could be included or not in a trial. This is actually a pretty important part of study design, which determines whether the clinical trial is going to be successful or not. So currently, clinical scientists spend a large amount of time manually going through historical clinical trial protocol documents to find trials that are similar to their own. And then they have an Excel sheet spread up where they make columns, which are previous trials, and then try to analyze that to come up with their own study design. So again, something that could be made way more efficient with machine learning. But again, a similar issue there with manual labeling is that, again, you need to do this in-house because your clinical trial protocol documents, you need to keep it internally. And to get clinical scientists to dedicate their valuable time to label large amounts of data is just not feasible. So in this case, they'd estimated that it would take 140 clinical scientists a month to label their entire training data set, which is not feasible, but due to them using Snorkel Flow, we're able to leverage this programmatic labeling approach to label 340,000 clinical trial protocol documents very effectively. And just to give you an example and not talk too much about it in detail, what we were able to do is build a complex machine learning pipeline that, given a clinical trial protocol document, can extract what are the disease name mentions in this document, and then map those to a certain set of chronic conditions, and then also do some post-processing to determine whether it is an inclusion or an exclusion criteria for a trial. So then what this lets you do is take all these clinical trial documents, which is unstructured data, and turn it into a very structured format of these are the standard set of chronic conditions we care about, and then here's how they're included or excluded in a trial, which lets you run wide-scale analytics in terms of how your internal clinical trials perform compared to, let's say, other drug manufacturers or all the publicly available clinical trials, and extract all these insights that were previously just not possible. And so, yes, we were able to label large amounts of data really effectively using our paradigm. And of course, if you label a large amount of data very quickly, you're able to leverage very powerful machine learning models that we have today to get really good scores on these tasks. Another thing to highlight here is not only did we label the data set really quickly and get to a good score very fast, but once their label schema changed, so let's say they now are interested in a different 15 set of chronic conditions, if you were doing manual labeling, you would have to go back and relabel your entire data set all over again if you were doing manual labeling. But with Snorkel's approach, we were able to relabel the entire data to an improved model on this new label schema within a day. So not only is it fast and maintains privacy of your data and allows you to bring in your own subject matter experts, it's also very adaptable in terms of being able to deal with changes in clinical trends or business goals changing and your application being able to adapt to that. So hopefully that painted a picture of some of the possibilities with Snorkel Flow. I know we went wide in terms of whether you're a payer, a provider, or a pharma company, some of the use cases you can tackle. But across the board, using Snorkel Flow, we're able to deliver on a number of NLP use cases. So whether you're trying to classify a document or extract various entities, whether you're trying to extract structured information, so let's say information that's in a particular table or things like, we're able to save months, if not years, in this hand labeling, months, if not years, compared to hand labeling in terms of being able to deliver machine learning applications very effectively. So if that sounded interesting, please feel free to reach out, and then we will also be taking questions. So please use the chat to enter any questions you may have.
Thanks so much, Arthi. And we do have a few minutes here for questions from the audience. It looks like we have one question, and I'll direct it to Arthi and Arjun. Are the labels always predefined?
Could you elaborate? Is it for the machine learning task that you're trying to do? I would assume yes, unless you follow.
We'll wait for Amro to elaborate a little bit. And then while we wait, a common question that we get asked is, how much of the workflow does Snorkel Flow address? Where does it begin and end? Maybe Arjun, if you want to take that, or Arthi.
Yeah, that's a really good question. We talked a lot about the Snorkel Flow approach, and we also talked about some outcomes we produce. So maybe it's helpful to also make real how much of that workflow is done in Snorkel. Snorkel Flow is an end-to-end application development platform, and really it begins with ingesting the data from a variety of different data sources that you already have at your enterprise, and then making it AI ready within the platform with our application templates and our pre-process. We then allow you to really label the data in the platform in a first-class way, and that's the whole programmatic labeling approach to data labeling. And what we've also found is that the model development and the data labeling problem are so tightly intercoupled that folks also develop and train their models in the platform. And that iterative loop is really, it's inconvenient for them to break. And what you end up really with is a model that can directly integrate with their production infrastructure. So really, it's the entire life cycle of data ingestion, making the data AI ready, labeling, making data again being the central theme over here, and then training the model in an iterative way and developing the model in an iterative way, and then making it production ready. And I think a big part of this is also just a very exhaustive set of connectors to bring the data in, and then also a set of connectors to make the model useful, be it through production serving or be it through batch processing. Does that answer the question, John?
Yeah, thank you so much. It does look like we are coming close to the time and not seeing any other questions. I want to move us to the end of our webinar. Thank you everyone for joining us today, and have a great rest of your day.